Chapter 6. Till little Arliss got us mixed up in that bear fight, I guess I'd been looking on him about like most boys look on their little brothers. I liked him all right, but didn't have a lot of use for him. What with his always playing in our drinking water and him getting in the way of my chopping axe, and howling his fool head off and chucking me with rocks when he got mad, didn't seem to me like he was hardly worth the bother of putting up with. But that day when I saw him in the spring, so helpless against that angry she-bear, I learned different. I knew then that I loved him as much as I did Ma and Pa, and maybe in some ways even a little bit more. So it was only natural for me to come to love the dog that saved him. After that, I couldn't do enough for Old Yeller. What if he was a big, ugly, meat-stealing rascal? What if he did fall over and yell bloody murder every time I looked crossways at him? And what if he had run off when he ought to have helped with the fighting bulls? None of that made a lick of difference now. He pitched in and saved little Arliss when I couldn't have possibly have done it, and that was enough for me. I petted him and made him over till he was wriggling all over to show how happy he was. I felt kind of mean about how I had treated him and did everything I could to let him know. I searched his feet and pulled out a long mesquite thorn that had become embedded between his toes. I held him down and had Ma help me with a stick of coal fire on it so that I could burn off 3 bloated ticks that I found on inside of his ears, and I washed him with lye soap and water and then rubbed salty bacon grease into his hair all over to rout out the fleas. And that night, after dark, when he sneaked into bed with me and little Arliss, I let him sleep there and never said a word about it to Ma. I took him and little Arliss squirrel hunting the next day. It was the first time I'd ever taken little Arliss on any kind of hunt. He was such a noisy pest that I always figured he'd scare off most of the game. And as it turned out, he was just as noisy and pesky as I'd figured. He followed along, keeping quiet like I told him, till he saw himself a pretty little butterfly floating around in the air. And then he'd set up and yell about how you could hear it from a mile off and go off chasing after a butterfly. Of course, he couldn't catch it, but he would keep on yelling at me to come help him, and then he'd get mad because I wouldn't and yell even louder. Or maybe he'd stop and turn over a flat rock, and then he'd stand yelling at me to come back and look at all the yellow ants and centipedes and crickets and stinging scorpions that went scurrying away, hunting up new hiding spots. Once he got hung up in some briars and yelled till I came back and helped him out. Another time he fell down and struck his elbow on a rock and didn't say a word about it for several minutes until he saw that blood was seeping out of a cut in his arm. And then he stood and screamed like he was burnt with a hot iron. With that much racket going on, I knew we'd scared all the game clean out of the country. Which I guess we did. All but the squirrels. They took to the trees where they could hide from us, but I was lucky enough to see which tree one squirrel went up, so I put some of little Arliss's racket to use. I sent him in a circle around the tree, beating on the grass and brushes with a stick while I stood a-waiting. And sure enough, the squirrel got to watching little Arliss and forgot about me. He kept turning around and around the tree limb, keeping it betwixt him and little Arliss, till he was on my side in plain sight. Well, I shot him out of the tree on the first shot. After that, Old Yeller caught on to what game he was after. He went to work then, trailing and treeing the squirrels that little Arliss was scaring up off the ground, and from then on, with Yeller to tree the squirrels and little Arliss to turn them on the tree limbs, we had some pickings. Wasn't but a little bit till I had shot 5. More than enough to make us a good squirrel fry for supper. A week later, Old Yeller helped me catch a wild gobbler that I'd have lost without him. We'd gone up to the corn patch to pick up a bait of black-eyed peas. I was packing my gun, and just as we got up to the slab rock fence that Pa had built around the corn patch, I looked over and spotted that gobbler doing our pea picking for us. The pea pods were still green yet, and most of them no further along than snapping size. This made them hard for the gobbler to shell, but he was having his work at it, pecking and a scratching so hard that he was raising a big old dust out in the field. "Why, that old rascal," Ma said. "He's just clawing those pea vines all to pieces." "Hush, Ma," I said. "Don't scare him." I lifted my gun, laid the barrel across the top of the rock fence. "I'll have him ready for the pot in a minute." It wasn't a long shot, and I had him sighted in dead to rights. I aimed to stick a bullet right where his wings hinged on his back, and I was holding my breath and all ready to squeeze off when little Arliss, who had gotten behind, came running up. "What you shooting at, Travis?" he yelled at the top of his voice. "What you shooting at?" Well, that made me and the gobbler both jump. The gun fired, and I saw the gobbler go down, but for a second later he was up again, streaking through the tall corn, dragging a broken wing. For a second I was so mad at little Arliss I could have wrung his neck like a frying chickens. I said, "Arliss, why didn't you keep your mouth shut? You made me lose that gobbler." Well, little Arliss didn't have sense enough to know what I was mad about, and right away he puckered up and went to crying and leaking tears all over the place. Some of them splattered clear down to his bare feet, making dark splotches in the dust that covered them. I always did say that when little Arliss cried he could shed tears faster than any crier I ever saw. "Wait a minute," Ma put in. "I don't think you've lost your gobbler yet. Looky yonder." She pointed, and I looked, and there was Old Yeller, jumping the rock fence and racing towards the pea patch. He ran up to where I had knocked that gobbler down, and he circled the place one time, smelling the ground and wiggling his stub tail, and then he took off through the corn the same way the gobbler went, yelling like I had beaten him with a stick. When he barked treed a couple minutes later, it was in the woods the other side of the corn patch. We went to him, and we found him, jumping at the gobbler that had run up a stooped old live oak and was perched there, panting, just a-waiting for me. So in spite of the fact that little Arliss had caused me to make a bad shot, we had us a real sumptuous supper that night. Roast turkey with cornbread dressing and watercress and wild onions that little Arliss and I found growing down in the crick next to the water. But when we tried to feed Old Yeller some of the turkey on account of him having saved it for us, he wouldn't eat it. He'd lick the meat and wiggle his stub tail to show how grateful he was, but he didn't swallow more than a bite or two. That puzzled Ma and me, because when we remembered back, we realized that he hadn't been eating anything we'd fed him for the last several days. Yet he was fat, with hair as slick and shiny as a dog eating 3 square meals a day. Ma shook her head. "If I didn't know better, I'd say that dog was sucking eggs, but I've got 3 hens a-setting, and 1 with bitty chicks, and I'm getting more eggs from the rest of them than I've gotten since last fall, so he can't be robbing the nests." Well, we wondered some about what Old Yeller was living on, but we didn't worry about it. That is, not until the day that Bud Searcy dropped by the cabin to see how we was making out. Bud Searcy was a red-faced man with a bulging middle, who liked to visit around the settlement and set and talk hard times and spit tobacco juice all over the place and wait for somebody to ask him for dinner. I never did have a lot of use for him, and my folks didn't really either. Ma said that he was shiftless. She said that was the reason the rest of the men folk left him at home to sort of look after the women folk and children while they were gone out on the cow drive. She said the men knew that if they took Bud Searcy along, they'd never get to Kansas before the steers were dead from old age. It would take Searcy that long to get through a visitin' and an eatin' with everyone between Salt Licks and Albany. But he did have a little white-haired granddaughter that I sort of liked. She was 11 and different from most girls. She'd hang around and watch what boys did, like showing how high they could climb a tree, or how far they could throw a rock, or how fast they could swim, or how good they could shoot. But she never wanted to mix in or try to take over and boss things. She just went along and watched and didn't say much. And the only thing I had against her was her eyes. They were big, solemn brown eyes and right pretty to look at. Only when she fixed them upon me, it always seemed that they looked clear through me and saw everything that I was thinking. That always made me sort of jumpy, so that when I could, I never would look right straight at her. Her name was Elizabeth, and she came with her grandpa the day that he visited us. They came riding up on an old shad-bellied pony that didn't look like he had had a fill of corn in a coon's age. She rode behind her grandpa's saddle, holding to his belt on the back, and her white hair was all curly and rippling in the sun. Trotting behind them was a blue tick she-dog that I always figured was one of Belle's pups. Old Yeller went out to bathe them as they rode up, and I noticed right off he didn't go around about like he really meant business. His yellin' bay sounded a lot more like he was just barking because he figured that that's what we expected him to do. And the first time I hollered at him, telling him to dry up all that racket, he hushed on up, which kind of surprised me, as hard-headed as he generally was. By the time Ma had come to the door and told Circe and Elizabeth to get down and come on right in, Old Yeller had started a romp with the blue tick she-dog. Elizabeth slipped to the ground, stood staring at me with those big solemn eyes, while her grandpa dismounted. Circe told Ma that he believed he wouldn't come into the house. He said that as hot as the day was, he figured he'd like it better sitting in the dog run. So Ma had me bring out our 4 raw-hide bottom chairs, and Circe picked the one that I always liked to sit in best. He got out a twist of tobacco, bit off a chew big enough to bulge his cheek, and went to chewing and talking and spitting juice right where we was all bound to step in and pack it all around on the bottoms of our feet. First thing he asked Ma if we were making out all right, and Ma told him that we were. Then he told her that he had gone to look after the other families while the men was gone, a mite heavy responsibility that was nearly working him to death, but that he was glad to do it. He said for Ma to remember that if the least little thing went wrong, she was to get in touch with him right away, and Ma said that she would. Then he leaned back his chair against the cabin wall and went to telling about what all was going on around the settlement. He told about how the dry weather was, how he looked for all the corn crops to fail and the settlement folks to be scraping the bottoms of their meat barrels before next spring. He told how the cows were going dry, and the gardens they was also failing. And he told how Jed Simpson's boy Roscoe was sitting on a turkey roost waiting for a shot when a fox came right up and tried to put the jump on him, and Rosol had to club it to death with his gun butt. This sure enough looked like a case of the hydrophoby to Circe, as anybody knew that no fox in his right mind was going to go jumping a hunter. Which reminded him of an uncle of his that got Mad Dog bit down in the pine woods of East Texas. This was way back when Circe was a little boy. As soon as the dog bit him, the man knew that he was bound to die, so he went and got a big log chain and tied one end round the bottom of a tree, and the other end to one of his legs. And right there he stayed till the sickness got him and he lost his mind. He was slobbering all at the mouth and a-moaning and a-screaming and ran at his wife and children, trying to catch them and bite them. Only, of course, the chain around his leg had held him back, which was the reason he chained himself to the tree in the first place, and right there, chained to that tree, he finally died, and they buried him under that same tree. But Circe sure hoped that we wouldn't have us an outbreak of hydrophoby in the Salt Licks and all die before the men got back from Kansas. Then he talked a while about a panther that had been caught and killed one of Joe Anston's colts, and how the Anston boys had put their dogs on the trail. And they ran that panther into the cave, and Jeff Anston followed in where the dogs had more sense to go, and got pretty badly panther mauled for his trouble. But he got himself the panther. Old Bud Searcy talked till dinner time, said not a word at all through dinner, and then went back to talking as quick as he swallered down the last bite. He told how some strange vermin, it wasn't a coyote, possum, skunk, or coon, had recently started robbing the settlement blind, or maybe it was somebody. Nobody could tell for sure. All they know was that they was losing meat out of their smokehouses, eggs out of their hen nests, and sometimes even whole pans of cornbread that women folk could set out to cool. Ike Fuller had been barbecuing some meat over an open pit and left it for a minute to go and get himself a drink of water, come back to find that 3 or 4 pound chunks of beef ribs had disappeared like it had gone up in smoke. The Salt Lick folks were getting pretty riled about it, Searcy said, and guessed that it would go hard with whomever was doing the raiding if they ever learned out what it was. Listening to this, I got myself an uneasy feeling. The feeling got worse a minute later when Elizabeth motioned to me to follow her down to the spring. We walked clear down there, with Old Yeller and the blue tick dog following with us, before she finally looked at me and said, "It's him." "What do you mean?" I said. "I mean it's your big yeller dog," she said. "I saw him." "Do what?" I asked. "Steal that bunch of ribs. I saw him get a bunch of eggs, too, from one of our nests." I stopped then and looked straight at her, and she looked straight back at me, and I couldn't stand it, and I had to look down. "But I'm not going to tell," she said. I didn't believe her. "I bet you do," I said. "No, I won't," she said, shaking her head. "I wouldn't, even before I knew he was your dog." "Why?" "Because Miss Prissy's going to have pups." "Miss Prissy?" "That's the name of my dog. And she's going to have pups, and your dog's going to be their pa, and I wouldn't want their pa to get shot." Well, I stared at her again, and again I had to look down. I wanted to thank her, but I didn't know the right words, so I fished around in my pocket and brought out an Indian arrowhead I'd found the day before, and I gave that to her. She took it and stared at it for a little bit, with her eyes shining, and then shoved it down deep into a long pocket that she had sewn into her dress. "I won't never tell," she said, and then whirled, tore out for the house, running as fast as she could. I went down and sat by the spring for a while. It seemed like I liked Bud seriously a lot better than I ever had before, even if he did talk too much and spit tobacco juice all over the place, but I was still bothered. If Elizabeth had caught Old Yeller stealing stuff at the settlement, then somebody else might as well. And if they did, they were sure liable to shoot him. A family might put up with one of its own dogs stealing from them if he was a good dog, but for a dog that left home to steal from everybody else, well, I didn't see much chance for him if he ever got himself caught. After Bud Searcy had eaten a hearty supper and started talking a while longer, he finally rode off for home, with Elizabeth riding behind him. I went then and gathered the eggs and held 3 back. I called Old Yeller off from the house and broke the eggs on a flat rock right under his nose and tried to get him to eat 'em. But he wouldn't. He acted like he'd never heard that eggs were fit to eat. All he would do was stand there and wriggle his tail and try and lick me on the face. It made me mad. "You thieving rascal," I said. "I ought to get a club and break your back in 14 different places." But I didn't really mean it, and I didn't say it loud and ugly. I knew that if I did, he'd fall over and start yelling like he was dying, and then I'd be in a fight with little Arliss again. "When they shoot you, I'm going to laugh," I told him, but I knew that I wouldn't. End of chapter 6.